In liberal democracies, we love to talk. One of the reasons is because we're all equally capable of forming an opinion, which is not quite the same thing as saying that all opinions are equally valid. But where we separate the wheat from the chaff is in the cut and thrust of public debate. Opinions that successfully weather criticism are knowledge, and we prize knowledge because it helps us make better decisions. Now, in theory, the laboratory where a lot of this debate should take place is the university. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week we're going to take a look at what Hayek has to say about free speech and the university. So I see this video as the first in a series on free speech in the university, which is a fairly contentious issue in our time. So contentious and polarizing, in fact, that it can be difficult to reach any objective vantage point from which to survey the matter. But scientific objectivity in human affairs is an impossible ideal anyway. No matter what, we approach all issues with certain philosophical assumptions in tow. Which, again, is not to say that all philosophical perspectives are equally valid. The best we can do, though, is to be fair and as honest as possible in our endeavor, full and well knowing that our investigation will have its biases. So what are my biases, then? I believe that insofar as the stories I have heard concerning deplatforming, safe spaces, cancel culture, microaggressions, insofar all of these stories about these things are true, I think that such things are both inimical and deeply dangerous to the institution of the university as well as to the students themselves. So what exactly am I talking about? Well, the United States, as usual, provides the most, shall we say, diverse examples. I refer to students at Duke University who demanded disciplinary action for those students who attended what they termed culturally insensitive parties, as well as mandatory implicit bias training for all professors. I refer to Emory, where students demanded that instructor evaluations include a category to report microaggressions. I refer to the majority who support the disinviting or deplatforming of speakers on the basis of their views or reputations. I refer to Wesleyan activists who trashed a newspaper for criticizing Black Lives Matter. I refer to the growing percentage of students who believe campuses should restrict free speech, from 54% in 2016 up to 61% in 2017, according to polls by the Knight Foundation. I refer to professors whose tenure is supposed to guarantee them the right to speak freely, losing their jobs for objecting to various programs such as anti-bias training. I refer to the imposition of a speech code at universities which is favored by 51% of college students according to a Wall Street Journal poll, such as the recent announcement at Brandeis University of a speech code where words or phrases such as picnic, trigger warning, insane, you guys, rule of thumb, policeman, congressman, and freshman are all blacklisted for their oppressive connotations. But it's not just an American thing. Canada has the same problem. So too do we find this movement gaining traction in Europe. Last year, Matthias Revers and Richard Traunmüller of the University of Leeds and University of Mannheim, respectively, published a study entitled "Is Free Speech in Danger on University Campus? Some Preliminary Evidence from a Most Likely Case." Some of the background research to their study indicates that students on the left are intolerant toward many speakers who are seen to violate their values, and more so than their right-leaning peers, and that American students tend to value inclusion and diversity more than free expression, and that 10% deem violence and 37% deem shouting down an acceptable measure to prevent someone from speaking. What some of the background research concludes is that self-censorship is the result. A general culture of conformity develops. where students are reluctant to share their views because they are afraid that other students will criticize their views for being offensive. And this self-censorship applies to professors as well, who feel restricted in their teaching. So, on the basis of this background, what did Revers and Traunmüller find in their study? They surveyed students at the Goethe University of Frankfurt, and I've provided a link to their study in the description for those of you who would like to take a closer look. When it comes to self-censorship, the researchers found that a quarter of students had experienced personal dismissal for voicing their opinion, and a third felt at least somewhat inhibited about giving their view on controversial issues in a class discussion. The students' political ideology is also significant. So students who placed themselves on the left of the political spectrum were more favorable to restricting free speech, and they were less tolerant of controversial views and speakers. By contrast, students who placed themselves on the right were more tolerant of controversial opinions concerning gender, homosexuality, immigration, and Islam, but they were also significantly more likely to withhold their political views during class discussion. It's also noteworthy that the students' desire to allow speech also fluctuated depending on the topic. For example, 69% of students were willing to accept on campus a speaker who believes that Islam is incompatible with the Western way of life. But that number drops to 44% of students who are willing to tolerate a speaker who argues that homosexuality is immoral and dangerous. But across all topic areas, this level of tolerance drops considerably when it comes to someone holding such views who teaches at the university. Finally, male students were significantly less likely to feel offended, more tolerant of controversial speech, more likely to openly give their opinion, and also less likely to be concerned with the consequences of their statements, and perhaps as a result, they were significantly more likely to experience personal dismissal or criticism for their views. Now, at this point, you could easily and justifiably say that this was just one study, and that the examples I cited earlier of infringements on free speech on campus are hardly representative. That may well be the case, and I have a feeling that various instances of silencing speakers, professors, and students alike are probably more prominent at elite universities than in the poorer, more inconspicuous universities. But I may be wrong on that. In any case, the reason I single out the elite institutions is because progressive ideas tend to start off as some form of what I'd like to call boutique politics, which only the privileged can actually afford to spend time and money on. But then they end up being taken up in one form or another by the intellectuals, whom Hayek called those second-hand dealers in ideas, before they are ground up into digestible morsels for ordinary people who have more pressing concerns. For example, many of us today have heard or even used the terms subconscious, Oedipus complex, denial, defense mechanism, when we're accounting for the psychology of someone, usually someone else, because someone else is always the person with the problems. Whether we properly understand these terms or not is immaterial. The fact is, they were all concocted by a great mind, that of Sigmund Freud, and they've trickled down into common usage and define the way we think about many aspects of human behavior and psychology. So too with boutique politics and with the ideas that circulate in universities, since they eventually come to permeate common ways of thinking. In fact, Hayek would say this is one of the reasons why free speech, and I would add especially in a university setting, is so important. As Hayek says, I quote, "Advance consists in the few convincing the many. New views must appear somewhere before they can become majority views. There's no experience of society which is not first the experience of a few individuals. It is because we normally do not know who knows best that we leave the decision to a process which we do not control. But it's always from a minority acting in ways different from what the majority would prescribe that the majority, in the end, learns to do better." Now, there's a bit of optimism or pessimism, depending on how you view it. There's a bit of optimism or pessimism in Hayek here, isn't there? Because one of the assumptions is that the minority's view would actually be an improvement on the majority's view. And then I don't necessarily think that's always the case. But in any case, the point for Hayek is that because unpopular opinions are likely to be suppressed, or more likely to be suppressed, it's all the more reason to uphold the right to express them. But whose right should we be defending here? If a controversial speaker is invited to a university and proceeds to give a talk during which his voice is drowned out by the voices of protesters, whose right to speak freely has been infringed upon? After all, one could say that both speaker and students were exercising their freedom of speech. And the fact is, unless you're well accustomed to the cacophony of everyone speaking at once, one person's speech necessitates the silence of another for a period of time, at least. I mean, that's how a conversation works. But who then is to adjudicate, in the context of the university, between students, professors, and speakers, all of whom have a right to speak? My sense is that given Hayek's concern with property rights, he would likely distinguish between public and private universities. He would say that private universities are subject to whatever the shareholders want, which is more or less the position we saw him take in an earlier video on corporate social responsibility. And that would have to include limiting free speech if they so choose. But I don't want to get into a legalistic debate here. I'm speaking theoretically. In some cases, the barriers to free speech are logistical or practical, as opposed to legal or theoretical. For example, if a student group wishes to demonstrate on some controversial issue where a security detail is required, then who pays for that? In some cases, that cost is forwarded to the demonstrating group, and it can be so expensive that it effectively prevents them from demonstrating, which means a price tag has been placed on free speech. Now, I think in such cases, if the university is unwilling to defray the costs of security, Hayek would not be opposed to demonstration organizers paying a fee for security as long as the fee is the same for all groups who wish to demonstrate, regardless of the topic they're demonstrating for or against. At the end of the day, Hayek would view demonstrators as another form of voluntary association, and he has absolutely no problem with that. The important point, though, for Hayek, as always, is that they should all be treated equally according to a general rule. Now, Hayek is echoing earlier giants in the liberal canon in his defense of free speech, and I should like to recall their arguments as well, because it's not just that free speech enables society to advance or minority views to eventually become majority views. Free speech, dissenting views, are valuable for each and every individual as well. So much so that it led the 19th century liberal John Stuart Mill in his famous 1859 text on liberty to proclaim, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit: the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So if the dissenting view is right, then you deprive yourself of the view, or you deprive yourself of the truth by silencing that opinion. And if the dissenting view is wrong, you deprive yourself of the opportunity to better understand and sharpen your own argument and make it better by testing it against this wrong opinion. And as Mill says later on, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. And Mill was hardly alone in arguing that defending free speech is in your interest, even if, nay, especially if, the view expressed is contrary to your own. More than half a century prior to Mill, we find Thomas Paine declaring with his inimitable eloquence at the beginning of his Age of Reason, "You will do me the justice to remember that I have always strenuously supported the right of every man to his own opinion, however different that opinion might be to mine. He who denies to another this right makes a slave of himself to his present opinion, because he precludes himself the right of changing it." Isn't that an interesting way of putting it? Silencing someone else deprives you the right of hearing another perspective. You are enslaving yourself to your present view, which may very well be wrong, by closing yourself off from other opinions. And you also run the risk of making a martyr of the silenced voice. But John Stuart Mill admits, to return to him, he admits of a third possibility, which is that both sides might actually have seized on a partial truth. And I would be remiss in my duty if I did not at least attempt to provide a few of the reasons why the more vocal campus progressives do not place a high premium on free speech. Some would argue that free speech means the freedom to accept the consequences of speech. In other words, so the logic goes, if you're deplatformed, then you probably had it coming. Besides, thanks to the various forms of media out there, such as social media, you still have other outlets for your views. Now, one of the other arguments we often hear is that we need to level the playing field so that other, more marginalized voices can be heard. I think any liberal should like to hear marginalized, unpopular voices. So the intention is good, though it's perhaps a bit more difficult to implement in practice. For example, who is to determine which voices are marginalized and which are not? That very process of determination in and of itself would require free speech. And to judge by some of the counter-demonstration crowds drawn by conservative activists on campus, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's actually the conservative voice that has been marginalized. Now, the irony here is that the culture of self-censorship and fear that is provoked by punishing students or professors for their views actually undermines the freedom from fear that progressives wish to secure by restricting free speech in the first place. But perhaps the issue is not free speech in the pursuit of truth at all. If you're absolutely certain of the validity or moral rectitude of your views, then why bother continuing to search for truth? You don't keep looking for your house keys once you've found them. Besides, in practice, you don't have the time to entertain absolutely every counter-argument to your views. It's simply the way it is. Now, if you're going to employ that argument, fair enough, but you must also be careful lest that flippant attitude be turned against your own views. Finally, one of the arguments we hear is that the intent of your speech is irrelevant and that what's really important is its impact. Its impact not on my rational faculties, but on my feelings. Do we need to be comfortable in order to learn? Or does learning happen, on the contrary, only when you're confronted with uncomfortable opinions, an uncomfortable truth, if you will? What I suspect for those who seek to silence speech is that this debate is not about free speech at all, but about power. Namely, empowering those who are believed to be marginalized. It has been said, for example, that universities have traditionally been a safe space for white males. The intellectual framework for this shift from the pursuit of truth to the pursuit of power did not spring out of nowhere. Its roots go back many, many years. And so what I'd like to do in the next couple of videos is take you back in time to investigate this shift that has come to pose such a dire threat to free inquiry and the noble search for truth. And that's what Hayek would say.
This guy is awesome. He's got a lot of great stuff to say. I hope you've really been enjoying our videos. If you have, and if you'd like to hear what Hayek has to say about something else, anything, then let me know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.